At approximately 9 a.m. on a calm and uneventful Sunday morning, a visibly shaken man identifying himself as Doctor Scott Sills made an urgent call to 911. His voice was filled with distress as he reported discovering a woman lying unconscious and unresponsive at the foot of a staircase. Following standard emergency protocol, the dispatcher instructed Dr. Sills to switch his phone to speaker mode so that he could be guided through immediate life-saving measures. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Despite their rapid response and professional efforts, they quickly assessed the situation and determined that Susan showed no signs of life. Suzanne Sills was born on July 30th, 1971, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Friends and teachers described her as diligent and fiercely intelligent, the type of student who not only earned top grades but also displayed a natural ability to lead and inspire others. She earned her MBA from a prestigious business school, where her professors quickly noted her sharp mind for finance and organizational strategy. Years before her marriage to Dr. Sills, Susan was in a different chapter of her life, navigating her first marriage while also confronting the emotional challenges of infertility. It was during this difficult period that she met Dr. Scott Sills, seeking expert medical help. What began as a doctor-patient relationship evolved into something far more personal. After finalizing her divorce, Susan and Scott married and embarked on building both a family and a business together. They poured their time, money, and passion into establishing a clinic dedicated to reproductive health and fertility treatments. Susan managed every non-medical aspect of the clinic with impressive precision: finance, marketing, human resources, and client outreach, while Scott focused on the clinical and scientific work. Their efforts quickly paid off. The clinic gained a glowing reputation for offering hope to couples who had nearly given up on having children of their own. Yet, as their clinic flourished and their public image gleamed, the reality behind closed doors became more complex. Over the years, those closest to Susan noticed a shift in her demeanor. Once bright and vivacious, she began to appear drained and less optimistic. Several friends and colleagues later reported that Susan sometimes confided in them about growing tensions at home. According to these accounts, she felt increasingly stifled in her marriage, describing her home life as emotionally difficult and tightly controlled. The spark that had once defined her relationship with Scott seemed to have faded into an atmosphere of tension and unspoken resentment. Then came the morning that would change everything. Around 9 a.m. on a quiet Sunday, a clearly distressed man identifying himself as Dr. Scott Sills placed a call to 911. His voice, while urgent, remained surprisingly steady as he informed the dispatcher that his wife had suffered a fall down a staircase in their home. He reported finding her unconscious and unresponsive at the base of the stairs. Following protocol, the dispatcher asked him to place the phone on speaker mode and began guiding him through basic life-saving procedures while emergency personnel were en route. When paramedics arrived shortly thereafter, they quickly determined that Susan was, tragically, beyond saving. Her condition suggested that she had been deceased for some time. One detail stood out. A cooking pot was found near her body, positioned unusually upright, as if it had not fallen naturally during a struggle or tumble, but had been placed with care or intent. This detail would later become a critical point of contention in the investigation. Scott offered an explanation that seemed both oddly specific and to some implausible. He told the responding officers that Susan had been preparing to walk the family dogs that morning, a task she performed routinely. According to him, she may have tripped on the stairs, fallen, and somehow become entangled in her scarf, suggesting that the dogs, possibly tugging on the scarf's ends, might have caused accidental suffocation. However, investigators were immediately skeptical. The story, while not impossible, seemed unlikely given the physical evidence and the state in which Susan was found. Detectives turned their attention to verifying Scott's account. The staircase in question stood over 13 feet tall. A fall from such a height could indeed cause serious injuries. But Susan was 45 years old, physically healthy, and known for her cautious and methodical nature. Friends and family were adamant that she was familiar with every corner of her home and would not have been careless, especially while descending the stairs she used daily. Further doubts emerged upon closer examination of the scene. The placement of certain items and the lack of chaotic evidence suggested that something was amiss. Adding to investigators' unease was Scott's demeanor. While he complied with law enforcement requests, allowing his home to be searched, submitting to DNA collection, and answering all questions, he remained notably composed. Simultaneously, a separate line of inquiry began, one focused on gathering insights from the couple's two children, 12-year-old twins, Eric and Mary Catherine. A detective sat down with them gently, aiming not to alarm but to understand. The twins spoke of their mother's recurring migraines, describing how she occasionally retreated to Mary Catherine's room during these episodes to escape light and noise. On the previous night, Susan had experienced one of these painful attacks. She had taken a pot with her, a precaution in case she became nauseous, along with her usual pain medication. Both children described their household as generally peaceful, emphasizing the routine nature of their mother's migraines. They said that Susan had gone to rest early, leaving the master bedroom empty. Around midnight, Scott reportedly went to check on her, only to find her already asleep. Mary Catherine, knowing her mother would not want to be disturbed, decided to sleep in her parents' room instead. At approximately 4 a.m, the stillness of the suburban home was broken by raised voices coming from the master bedroom. Young Eric Sills, just 12 years old, was abruptly awakened by what appeared to be a heated exchange between his parents, Dr. Scott Sills and Susan Sills. His sister, Mary Catherine, also stirred from her sleep, alarmed by the intensity of the voices. When Mary Catherine hesitantly asked her father what had happened, Dr. Sills calmly reassured her that it was merely a small disagreement. Although Scott's explanation seemed simple enough on the surface, law enforcement officers investigating the events that followed found themselves with more questions than answers. During his official interview with detectives, Scott elaborated on the events of the early morning. He explained that when he went to check on Susan around 4 a.m., he found her hunched over her laptop. Despite battling a severe migraine, she was still absorbed in work, something he said was typical of her unrelenting drive. Concerned about her health, he claimed he urged her to rest and step away from the screen. But Susan, known for her resolve, allegedly refused to stop working, insisting that she needed to respond to several important emails. Their disagreement, though brief, apparently left both spouses frustrated. Eventually, Scott said, the matter settled and the family returned to bed. By 6:30 a.m., just 2.5 hours later, Scott suggested to Mary Catherine that they enjoy a refreshing morning swim in the backyard pool, something the family occasionally did together. Mary Catherine agreed, but what she saw when she left her parents' bedroom changed everything. There, at the base of the staircase, was her mother. Susan was unresponsive. A long scarf was wrapped around her neck, and a metal pot was lying nearby. Scott told investigators that the scarf had been used regularly by Susan during her migraine episodes. He said it helped her block out light and sound and had previously belonged to Mary Catherine. According to his theory, Susan had the scarf on as a form of comfort. The pot, he explained, was likely carried with her in case she became nauseous, as was often the case during her most painful migraine attacks. However, many aspects of the scene did not add up. Investigators began to express growing skepticism about Scott's narrative. As detectives examined the scene more closely, their doubts intensified. They noted that the scarf was tightly wrapped around Susan's neck in a manner inconsistent with accidental entanglement. The position of the pot also appeared unnatural, as though it had been set down intentionally, not dropped during a fall. Further complicating matters, Scott had visible injuries, a fresh laceration across his forehead and a significant bruise on his arm. When asked, he stated these were sustained during a car repair the previous afternoon. He even claimed that Eric had helped him in the garage. But when investigators asked Eric about this, the boy gave a different account. He remembered working with his father on the vehicle, but firmly stated that Scott had not hurt himself during their time together. This contradiction raised red flags for detectives, who were becoming increasingly concerned that Scott's story may not be entirely truthful. Another inconsistency emerged when Eric recalled seeing his mother placing the family's dogs into their crate the night before. This was unusual, especially considering her weakened condition. Why would Susan have planned to walk the dog so early in the morning, particularly while dealing with a migraine severe enough to force her into bed hours earlier? As investigators continued to comb through the home, forensic experts discovered biological material, possible DNA traces, inside the bedroom where Susan had gone to rest. The presence of these stains surprised the children, particularly Mary Catherine, who told police that the room had been completely clean when her mother entered it the night before. The finding didn't match with the tidy and quiet environment Susan had sought for relief from her pain. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, law enforcement was cautious. The material found in the room was suspicious but inconclusive. No arrest could be made without definitive proof of foul play. Instead, authorities continued collecting evidence, submitting everything, from the scarf to the pot, from Susan's laptop to her phone, for forensic testing. The preliminary medical examiner's report came just 4 days after the incident. Disappointingly, it offered no clear resolution. The findings were ambiguous and did not confirm the cause of Susan's passing beyond all doubt. A more in-depth toxicology screening, along with an analysis of tissue samples and trace materials, could take weeks, if not months. Investigators were determined not to rush to conclusions given the highly sensitive and complex nature of the case. In the meantime, law enforcement began focusing on mapping out Susan's social and professional life in greater detail. They reviewed her recent messages and calendar events, hoping to find context for her emotional state in the days leading up to the tragedy. Their goal was to understand whether stress from work or something more personal might have contributed to the events of that morning. Susan's professional circle was broad and included numerous physicians, administrators, and former patients. After speaking with several individuals, detectives eventually found a colleague who described Susan as increasingly anxious and withdrawn in recent months. This witness, who had worked with her on several cases, recalled Susan voicing concerns about personal control and balance within her marriage, details that seemed consistent with the picture her close friends had painted earlier. As for Dr. Scott Sills, those who knew him professionally described a different man, cheerful, accomplished, and always composed. His students at the university where he occasionally lectured remembered him as an energetic and kind teacher, someone with a bright future and an enviable resume. He had graduated from high school at the top of his class, completed a law degree, and then pivoted into medicine, where he specialized in reproductive health, a path that eventually led him to meet Susan. When news broke of Susan Sills' sudden and tragic passing, her friends, colleagues, and family were overwhelmed by grief. In those first few days, nearly everyone who knew her believed the incident to be nothing more than a heartbreaking and inexplicable accident, an unfortunate series of events that had led to a fatal fall. The initial shock swept through her personal and professional circles, silencing doubts and encouraging mourners to focus on her memory rather than the circumstances of her death. However, as detectives began their formal investigation and started interviewing witnesses, something unexpected occurred. Many individuals, friends, clinic staff, neighbors had already been in contact with her husband, Dr. Scott Sills. What they reported to investigators gave cause for concern. In their conversations with Scott, they noticed his stark refusal to speak about Susan's death. His reluctance to discuss even the most basic details of what had happened sent up red flags for those closest to the family. To them, it didn't appear to be the quiet mourning of a devastated spouse. It felt evasive. This behavior only amplified the suspicions of investigators. What had initially been treated as a potential domestic mishap was now quickly developing into what authorities believed could be a far more serious case. Based on inconsistencies, unusual behavior, and emerging details, detectives began to consider the strong possibility that Susan's death had not been an accident at all, but rather a deliberate act. As they delved further into Scott's statements, investigators noticed a troubling pattern. When speaking about his late wife, Scott often praised her business acumen. He referred to her as a capable co-founder and a smart manager, someone who was invaluable in operating their fertility clinic. But what struck many observers as strange was his complete avoidance of acknowledging her roles as a wife and mother. They spoke of her professionally, not personally, as if their shared life had been more of a corporate arrangement than a marriage built on love and family. Detectives began gathering statements from clinic staff to get a broader picture of Scott's behavior before and after the incident. One particularly observant nurse, who had long worked alongside the doctor, shared her observations. Before Susan's death, Scott had been, in her words, a rather average man in appearance. But within weeks of the tragedy, she noticed a startling transformation. He had undergone a hair transplant and was suddenly taking much more care in how he dressed and presented himself. His physical appearance was no longer an afterthought. He began posting regularly on social media, updating his profile pictures and frequently sharing personal updates. It didn't take long before he began a relationship with a new woman. To outsiders, it seemed that Scott had moved on with surprising speed, perhaps too quickly for a grieving widower. Though no one could fault someone for seeking companionship, the contrast between his behavior and the timeline raised eyebrows within the community and within law enforcement. Yet, despite this growing collection of red flags, the hard evidence needed to charge Scott remained elusive. The pieces were there, but none were sharp enough to cut through the uncertainty, at least not yet. In 2018, the case took a significant turn. After many months of meticulous laboratory work, the coroner's office completed an advanced forensic analysis of the DNA evidence found in Mary Catherine's bedroom, the place where Susan had reportedly gone to rest during her migraine. The results confirmed the presence of both Susan's and Scott's DNA. While not definitive proof of wrongdoing, it offered important confirmation that Scott had been physically close to Susan in the location where she was last seen alive. Then, on August 8, 2018, nearly 2 years after Susan's passing, detectives returned to the Sills family home. This time, their visit was not a routine follow-up, it was direct. One of the lead investigators looked Scott in the eyes and asked him the question that had loomed over the case for months: "Did you kill your wife?" Scott's reaction was immediate and telling. His demeanor changed. He grew visibly uncomfortable. Beads of sweat appeared on his brow, and he adopted a defensive posture. Still, he denied any involvement, maintaining that Susan's death had been a tragic accident. While police now felt confident that a crime had occurred, the burden of proof remained high. To build a prosecutable case, they needed more than instinct. They needed hard evidence. That's when they turned to Susan's digital devices, particularly her smartphone and laptop. Investigators believed that Susan, a meticulous and thoughtful woman, may have left behind some clues. Their hunch paid off. Within her messages and private notes, detectives found multiple instances in which Susan expressed deep dissatisfaction with her marriage. She had written that she no longer trusted her husband and was considering leaving him. Susan worried that her departure would threaten his financial stability and professional reputation. Further examination of Scott's own phone revealed something equally disturbing. Among his saved files was a screenshot of a photograph that investigators believed may have played a role in Susan's decision to leave. The image, dated August 30, 2016, carried personal significance, and its context, though not publicly disclosed, was described by authorities as potentially damaging to Scott's personal or professional life. Investigators believed that jealousy, combined with fear of public embarrassment or business loss, may have motivated Scott to act irrationally and violently. Adding to their concerns, police discovered that Scott had contacted a life insurance company the very next day after Susan's death. He had attempted to claim a $250,000 policy payout. The timing alone raised suspicions, and given that the circumstances of Susan's passing were still under investigation, the insurance company denied the claim due to potential foul play. Finally, on April the 25th, 2019, Over 2.5 years after Susan Sills was found lifeless at the base of her staircase, Dr. Scott Sills was formally arrested on suspicion of murder. At the time of his arrest, he was en route to perform a medical procedure. Authorities took him into custody, setting bail at $1 million, which Scott posted without delay. He was released pending trial. The long-awaited trial began in November 2023, 7 years after Susan's death. In court, Scott Sills' legal team presented an alternative theory of events. According to the defense, Susan had fallen down the stairs due to the disorienting effects of her migraine combined with medication. The house dogs, confused and excited by the commotion, had tugged on her scarf, unintentionally tightening it around neck. Unexpectedly, the deceased's daughter, Mary Catherine, spoke out in support of this version. Now 19 years old, Mary Catherine was no longer the young girl detectives had questioned on the morning of her mother's death. She had grown into a thoughtful and articulate young woman, and despite the tragedy that had shattered her family, she maintained a strong and steady relationship with her father, Dr. Scott Sills. As the trial entered its most crucial phase, Mary Catherine came forward, not as a witness for the prosecution, but in defense of the man now on trial for her mother's murder. According to her statement, on that fateful morning 7 years earlier, she did in fact witness something unusual. She remembered seeing the family's dogs playing near her mother, specifically pulling at the ends of the scarf Susan had wrapped around herself, something the girl hadn't understood at the time. The memory had remained dormant for years, buried in confusion. Mary Catherine explained that she never mentioned it to investigators during the original interviews because no one had asked her directly, and as a child, she hadn't realized the potential significance of what she had seen. Her voice shook in court as she explained, "I was only 12. I didn't know what mattered and what didn't. I didn't think it was important back then." She also noted a crucial detail regarding the scarf, one that aligned with the defense's timeline. When she and her father attempted to assist Susan before the paramedics arrived, they had removed the scarf from her neck while trying to perform first aid. That, she claimed, was why it was found at a distance from her body rather than tightly wrapped around her when emergency services entered the home. To support Mary Catherine's claims, the defense team commissioned a new forensic examination of the scarf. This time, DNA testing confirmed the presence of canine biological material on the fabric. Trace elements from the dogs, hair follicles and microscopic skin cells were found embedded in the weave of the material. The defense presented this as proof that the dogs had interacted with the scarf in a physical way, likely pulling on it just as Mary Catherine described. In addition, the toxicological analysis presented during the trial lent partial credibility to the theory that Susan may have suffered an accidental fall. According to the medical report, multiple medications were detected in her bloodstream, including a combination of painkillers and sedatives. These drugs had been prescribed for the treatment of her severe migraines. Furthermore, in the days leading up to her death, Susan had reportedly eaten very little and complained of constant fatigue. The defense argued that this physical frailty, combined with medication, may have caused disorientation, making a fall down the stairs more likely. Despite the new evidence, the prosecution remained steadfast. They called Mary Catherine's late revelations into question, suggesting her recollection might be shaped by loyalty to her father or by the passage of time. Prosecutors emphasized that while the scarf may have had traces of the dogs, the overall circumstances surrounding Susan's death still pointed to something far more intentional. One key argument put forward by the state involved the absence of physical evidence on the staircase. Experts testified that if Susan had actually fallen, there should have been biological traces, blood, tissue, or fibers on the staircase itself. But investigators found nothing. The staircase, with its 13 steps, showed no physical sign of a traumatic fall. According to the prosecution, this absence supported the theory that Susan had not fallen naturally, but was instead placed at the base of the stairs to stage an accident. Prosecutors also focused on the troubling position of Susan's body. During the initial emergency call, the 911 dispatcher had clearly instructed Scott to begin CPR on a flat, hard surface. standard procedure in any resuscitation attempt. Yet, when first responders arrived, Susan's leg was still resting on a step, and her position had not been moved. According to the prosecution, this strongly suggested that Scott had not genuinely attempted life-saving measures, but had instead posed her body to reinforce the narrative of an accidental fall. The state then returned to its central theory: motive. They argued that Scott was deeply unsettled by a photo Susan had shared publicly shortly before her death. This image, innocuous to outsiders, allegedly sparked feelings of jealousy and insecurity in Scott, emotions that festered and eventually exploded into a fatal confrontation. The prosecution emphasized that Susan had reportedly intended to leave Scott and take her share of the clinic with her. Text messages and journal entries recovered from her devices revealed that she felt emotionally stifled and financially strapped. The prosecution also questioned the credibility of the statements made by the couple's son, Eric. While Eric had earlier told investigators that his father had not sustained any injuries while they worked on the car together, the state argued that Eric could have been mistaken or even unconsciously influenced. After all, both Eric and Mary Catherine were young and traumatized at the time, making their observations susceptible to distortion. Scott Sills, throughout the trial, chose not to testify in his own defense, a decision that puzzled some and angered others. For 3 weeks, the courtroom was filled with conflicting narratives, emotional testimonies, and scientific evidence that offered as many questions as answers. When the closing arguments concluded, the courtroom fell silent as the jury was given their instructions. It took them only 3 hours of deliberation to return a verdict that would bring resolution to some and anguish to others. Dr. Scott Sills, 58 years old, was acquitted of first-degree murder, meaning the jury did not believe the crime had been planned in advance with clear premeditation. However, he was found guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that indicated the jury believed Susan's death had resulted from an intentional act, but without prior calculation. The sentence was handed down shortly after: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years.